you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. What do you see as the primary factors driving the rise of populist and far-right parties in Europe, which is one of the most affluent parts of the planet? Are there common social, economic, or political conditions that are particularly conducive to their growth across different European countries?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting question, and I'm glad that we can basically discuss this issue, because if you, as you already said, if we look at Europe, we rather could be stunned that this is a very wealthy and rich country, and why this emergence now of far-right, particular far-right and racist populism. And in my view, it has to do with, let's say, the population themselves. It's a class issue. Let's say, unlike prejudices that sometimes are floating around, it's very much an issue. It has become an issue basically of a middle class section of society who fears increasingly to lose their social status. And this issue in terms of losing social status means that, of course, you have some sense of where you are, where you've been, which is tied into a sense of entitlement, unfortunately, the sense of entitlement that many European citizens, and to bring this up, the notion of citizens, unfortunately, do have in countries, in different European countries. So I think that's a common pattern. We are still speaking about territorial citizenship rights, all right? The European Union, or the Europe as an imagination, did not kind of promote or engage more with the idea that there could be some kind of common European citizenship, which is not only connected to the different national identities and national citizenship. And the rise, or the rise, particularly in the last 10 years, is of course also connected to this economic crisis of 2008. Some people forget, or tend to forget, what that meant. It meant, on the one hand, and even like I think even Habermas was raising this years ago, so that profit is individualized and the risk is socialized. And that means that the costs of living crisis we are in, and actually seeing that more people kind of are, let's say, losing ground in terms of income, in terms of job security. That's not only fiction, that's also real. And we have to combine this with the experience of the pandemic, obviously. And some people, let's say white collar workers, academics like me, or those perhaps working in offices, I think we're pretty much privileged because we could switch to online work. We did not, let's say, we might have felt isolated and all these kind of emotional package, but we kind of were continuing with work. And this is a very, very different experience for young people, particular, you know, who lost jobs, students who lost jobs, perhaps. And this kind of, let's say, this feeling of anxiety, that's a feeling of anxiety. Are you still there? You look a bit frozen to me in the picture. Are you there? Okay. So this feeling of anxiety and insecurity that has spread across the board in different European countries. That said, it's sometimes complicated, and the journalist or moderator in Paris raised this issue vehemently, that there might be also a division between different regions of Europe or the European Union. So it might be a slightly different story to tell with respect to East European Union countries, with Western, so-called Western or Central European countries different to Scandinavia, perhaps. So we have also to be very careful to, let's say, put everyone in the sack and think this is all the same in all the different countries. I rather would suggest that, and I think studies, or most studies or researchers do this, looking what's going on in different countries and try to understand what is triggering this. Of course, we have some commonalities, as I said already in Paris. The housing crisis. The housing crisis is an issue not only in Ireland. I know that it has triggered these debates, and the success, by the way, the success of the far-right party in the Netherlands. It's an issue in Spain. And of course, these are very, very different countries. But what they share is the commercializing, or let's say already an ugly way of commercializing anything that's related to have housing, or they have sometimes a non-existing renting market. As you know, I'm originally from Germany, and I guess Germany has a very, at least in some parts, I'd say maybe in Berlin things also get worse, but on the average, it's highly regulated. Renting is highly regulated. I'm not only talking about provision of social housing. I'm really seriously talking about the idea that people also have a right to decent housing as part of a renting market, which, for example, doesn't exist neither in the UK nor in Ireland. And I'm focusing here on Ireland because it's part of the European Union still. So we have really a big problem if we think of what's going on here. And this, in my view, is one of the major things different policy actors or politicians have to tackle urgently. To have thinking of having a boat as a kind of human right, even, and the rise, and that's not by chance. And we will come back perhaps in the next couple of questions on this issue. It's connected. It's connected to this kind of xenophobic, or rise of xenophobic hate in different countries towards migrants and refugees. It's connected, that's why I'm saying. So the big words here are, there is a sense of entitlement on the one hand of those that we could say settled citizens, and being, let's say, irritated or appalled by the kind of accommodation of international migrants, whereas let's say, their needs, their situation in different local places is not being resolved. And
All right. In your speech at the conference, Do Not Wake the Dragon, you often refer to history. Why do you think history is so central in understanding the rise of far-right populism?
I'm a historical sociologist, not only a political sociologist. And as I said earlier, coming from Germany and being one of, let's say, born in the 60s. So you have to come to terms with what that kind of history, National Socialism, institutionalized anti-Semitism, Holocaust meant not only to Germany, but to the whole country, so to speak, to Europe. And while studying, or it's in my recent publication with my Australian colleague Scott Pointing on the normalization of the global far right, you can see that it's absolutely important and central to go back also to witnesses, contemporary witnesses of the rise of Hitler National Socialism, or at least also in other countries, fascism, let's say in Italy, for example, or Spain, to understand what we coined as normalizing processes. And history, or that, of course, this knowledge is available. There are books, there's archive material, there's documentaries on that. And the shocking, and that's why I, let's say, put so much emphasis on this, the really shocking reality is to understand that within 10 years, let's say, a very cosmopolitan, modern, diverse society as it was in Germany at the time, in, let's say, end of 20s, suddenly, in inverted commas, suddenly could change to this monocultural, anti-Semitic, racist society. And that's why I, the figure, or let's say the mythical figure of the dragon comes in here, because my argument would be like, it's placed, or it's inside liberal democracy, it's inside what capitalism is about. And it needs, or there's perhaps, let's say, the mixture of what I said to you earlier in response to your question, a mixture of socio-economic crisis on the one hand, and attempts to target and to manipulate to a certain degree majority populations to believe, or to make believe, that there's one scope, one other group who is responsible for all the mess that is created. And historically speaking, it was the Jews in Europe, European Jews, assimilated in different national countries, so they felt very much German or French or Romanian or Bulgarian whatsoever. But they were basically then targeted as the other scapegoat, of the group who is responsible for this push in modernity, responsible for the mess, perhaps, or the disadvantage particularly deprived classes might endure. And that element, let's say the temporal proximity, which is shocking, if I say, like, from the 20s to the early 30s, so it's within 10, 13 years, this changed rapidly. So that's a reminder. How we can relate to what happened back then, which is happening to a certain degree in front of our eyes. We are witnessing this crash, because, as you know, we have lived through the 1980s, 90s, where multiculturalism was appreciated, diverse societies, equality, values of inclusion. And I guess you might agree on that. We couldn't think, or let's say in terms of emotional thinking, or expecting that within 10, 15 years, the discourse would change that dramatically. And that has, of course, consequences in terms of what kind of parties are available. Some of these far-right parties, for example, in France, have been established, were there for years now. So it's not a new phenomenon in that sense, but the normalization itself, it's a process where the identifications conveyed in their programs or in what they are saying has become respectable, normalized, acceptable to a majority of people. And I say not majority in terms of numbers of population, but a significant, let's say, put it like that, a significant minority who might then bring, or has the power in that sense, going back to what I said earlier, territorial voting rights. They have the power to basically allow these parties to go into parliament, not only into national elections, but of course, that's the reason why we're talking here. Now, the European Parliament as well. And that's a concern. And in my view, that's why I still would always argue, please, bother, go back to history books, go back to listen to what contemporary witnesses have to say, what that meant, because otherwise you might not comprehend and not understand. Perhaps most people don't understand, because it's partly human nature that we take things for granted. Only if we are losing them, we might then be shocked. Hello, and that's probably the job of me as an academic, or you as an organization who is watching what's going on, to allure and to alarm people what's going on right now, and that it's not as new. That's the point. It's not new. It's not new. It has been done beforehand, and it's not let's simple like history is repeating. I mean, but elements are there, you know. So there is a concern, and to end this, let's say my response to this question, I like citing intellectuals of the Frankfurt School in Exile, Adorno and Horkheimer, if this rings a bell. And my favorite sentence is still, that's why history matters. You know, Max Horkheimer was saying writing in 1939, who doesn't want to talk about capitalism should be silent on fascism. And in my view, it encapsulates still what the problem is about. Okay.
All right.
And Adorno in the 60s, he gave a very famous lecture in Vienna, actually. I think this was published in German as well in English, which is interesting because he was already, let's say, envision that the transformation or different stages of capitalism might lead again to this feeling of losing social status, concentration of capital, you know, this push we are witnessing, we are seeing further push in modernity and a push in what late capitalism is about. So, yeah.
All right. How do the increasing populist and far-right tendencies in various member states affect the process of European integration and overall stability of the European Union? Are there specific policy areas like migration where their influence is particularly noticeable? Can you please especially explain the role of migration as one of the propellers of far-right populism in Europe?
Yeah, it ties back, or it's related to what I said earlier, that migration as the main problem was staged, in my view. I wouldn't go that far to simply compare the, let's say, projection of anxieties and racism of Jews in the 30s to migrants, but we have similar patterns and similar structures. So the issue, again, the let's say the ideologically loaded notion of migration and the migrant or the migrants, okay, is something, again, that's developed over years. I mean, as sitting in the European Union and me sitting outside the European Union, it's very interesting to understand that until 2016, you know, before Brexit happened, there was always a distinction between migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. And to a certain degree, these distinctions that also kind of cling to legal distinction, obviously, were at some point collapsed. So we're not only talking about migrants, about migration as an issue. It does not kind of, it produces anxieties for the reasons I outlined earlier. If I have a systemic housing catastrophe, as the Irish president was already saying 2 years ago, Higgins, and there is no strategy to resolve the problem, it's easier than to blame arriving international protection applicants and refugees who have been or should be housed, so they have a right to accommodation, whereas you have a situation in different countries, not only of homelessness, but also this kind of what kind of housing is available or affordable to people. And that's always kind of creating these divisions. And unfortunately, media and politics is not helpful here. They really play the tune. They play the tune of far-right populism while creating this division, while creating this boundary, because it would look very, very different, to say this is an issue for all of us people living in a particular country. We are basically trying to have a notion of solidarity here. it's easier to say, you know, there are 13,000, I'm just dropping a number, just as an example, 13,000 refugees coming into the country. We might have homeless people, let's say 10,000. And even if let's say 10,000 people are not the people who are really kind of allowed to vote because they don't have a house, they don't have an address, you know what I mean? So it's the others who think, oh, that's unfair. I rather relate, for example, to an Irish citizen than to, I don't know, a refugee or someone coming from Sudan. And of course, it's also intersecting with racism very, very strongly, white bodies, black bodies. It's gendered, you know, it's very much gendered. So who's welcomed or who's allowed to stay. And so it's a mixture of different areas, really. So and the migration, in my view, migration became politicized, using this emotion or distress of people to channel anger, to not be fair or open on a capitalist interest, because housing market is commercialized. It's an interest, you know, interest focused, privatized issue. It's not collective. So there are certain discussions that have, in my view, really got out of hand. And again, media and politicians, mainstream politicians, were and are not helpful in this degree, because they kind of following the lead of far-right populist politicians and leaders in that kind of view. And the, let's say, efforts really to counter this division, these divisions, and the racism conveyed in this, I don't see that much, you know, going on in at least the news I'm able to follow, which in my case would be rather like German-speaking news and English-speaking news. But yeah, so
Right. All
yeah.
right. What strategies are populist and far-right parties using to attract voters ahead of the upcoming EP elections? How are they framing their messages to resonate with the broader audience? And what role does social media play in their campaigns?
I have to say, this question is a bit beyond my comfort zone. As I made clear, I'm more or less outside the European Union for a few years. So, but what they do, or what I, let's say, understand they do very successfully in different countries, is that they basically have a sense what kind of anger, what kind of, social economic upset is out there, and successfully also in different localities, and I'm pronouncing localities in the sense of the subnational level. So they go there and take, let's say, the frustration and the anger of local people seriously, apparently. They do this more successful on perhaps because, and as you know, a crucial element of populism is this anti-elite segment. So arguing the political elite does not listen to your concerns. And, you know, they had the chance, let's say, for 20 years, what did they do to you? And they haven't done that much. It's a success story for far-right or for populists in that respect, because they can relate and communicate with people on a very, very local level to at least pretend that they take their concerns seriously. And then in terms of social media, I mean, I mentioned the pandemic earlier. The pandemic, in my view, triggered a lot of what's going on and the potential of social media in terms of conspiracy theories, in terms of using this, and you know that not only WhatsApp, but Telegram, different forms of social media communication to spread not only their news, but creating false news and fake news, and the mobilizing, you might have heard about this in the Irish context last year, Dublin. This was really based on false information about what happened, but also the actors involved, and then giving space, because Gardaí, so the Irish police, apparently was not prepared, for that kind of outrage and what happened, the riots on the streets. But that's what they do. I mean, they are very, very capable, I think, in using social media. So it's also a generation thing. I mean, belonging to a generation where you rather perhaps with assuming that the younger generations automatically, okay, would be more on the liberal and left-wing side. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It's much more fragmented. And the identitarian movement, you know that in France, they basically capture perhaps also the lifestyle and the interest of younger people. And that's of course a big concern in terms of and I mean, again, like I use some of social media, but I'm pretty sure not to that kind of extent that I could really understand what's going on, apart from that this is a tool perhaps by not that much used or understood by established parties. But that's, again, that would be like a generational issue, I rather think. So, yeah.
In your opinion, what measures can mainstream political parties and civil society take to effectively counter the narratives and influence of populist and far-right movements? Are there successful examples of such counter strategies in recent European political history?
Yeah, I was thinking European history sounds big, but I refer here, let's say, to very constructive, positive experience of a group which is called Hope Not Hate. They sit in Ireland, and what they do, and they started originally with a different name, which was more kind of explicitly saying we're watching what the far right is doing. So they shifted attention to a more positive, inclusive vision. And what they do, they similar in some ways, that's interesting, similar to some of the strategies of far-right populism, they go back to these local communities. And they take or try to take seriously what their concerns are. All right. And then not kind of stigmatizing immediately someone who is coming forward, let's say protesting, and I'm just illustrating this, protesting that some or new asylum seekers were accommodated in a hotel which was free or empty beforehand, but going there and then trying to engage and have a dialogue or conversation with people to understand where their anxieties and where their frustration and where their angst, where their concerns are coming from. And I think that's hugely important, not to, because it's also related to a feeling of deprivation or experience of deprivation, but also experience in a very kind of material sense. It's not by chance that quite often in poorer parts or neighborhoods of cities or in the countryside, people are almost dumped. They're and then these communities who have experienced perhaps deprivation on a larger scale then are confronted with perhaps a larger group of people. They look different, they speak different, their culture is different, and there is not this kind of encompassing structure where you would say, okay, level down or come to terms with your fear and try to learn about this group as individuals, and this has been done, or in some places has been done in terms of volunteers, not only doing language training, for example, but also shared cooking, shared socializing. Really, it's about socializing as well, because as soon as you break down this barrier or this kind of strangeness, that the other is almost like non-human or dehumanized in that sense. It's part of a group, and the group is stigmatized. So you don't have any normal, in that sense, normal or spontaneous communication. And I think that's what's happening. I mean, as soon as people target a specific group, okay, and the group becomes marginalized, then it becomes at some point very abstract. And then it's easy to criminalize this. What's happening right now here? I mean, the illegal, I mean, just listen to what it means. The illegal migration bill. At another time, I'd say the migration bill would have been illegal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So some things become legal, but in terms of ethical or deeper understanding of what law and justice should be about, it's the opposite. And again, that's where I come from with my historical knowledge, that we have to be very, very aware of how a legal system is established, whose purpose, or the purpose is criminalization and marginalizing and racializing others. And that's on the agenda.
And how do you think a possible victory by Donald Trump at the upcoming US elections will affect the normalization of global far-right movements?
Yeah, my spontaneous answer to this is it's already normalized. It's normalized. That's the problem. The normalization, again, it's a process which started 10, 20 years ago. It might even have started after 9/11 in terms of racializing Muslim communities and so forth. It's really a process where people get used to accepting, that's the point, accepting that a group who actually could be regarded as vulnerable could be stigmatized. And you're sitting in Brussels, so Belgium. So some of the continental European countries, very much to my dislike, have this headscarf criminalization or the targeting of gendered clothes. And that's what I mean, the normalization to accept that wearing certain kind of clothes could be criminalized. This is part of a process of normalization. If Trump, and in my view, it's very likely he wins second term, okay? But he started already much earlier, and we know that. And it becomes almost like a theater of absurdity. I mean, this guy, or he could, as a politician, more or less encourage, followers to go against the symbolic, let's say, the symbolic building of liberal democracy in the United States. He was kind of should stand trial, but in the end, the most, let's say, most successful trial now seems to be his whatever sexuality, or when he paid some money for this prostitute. So I think it tells the story where we are already, where we are. Okay, so it's not, it might be a new stage, and that's very relevant in terms of international politics, of course, but it's not a symptom of a new stage of normalization, because the normalization, the accommodating of far-right racist white superiority in the sense of Trump, what he embodies, I think, it's very much about machismo, patriarchy, white superiority, and so forth. So it's part of a process, and that's a shocking side that, and I mentioned that not yet. What we see in different societies, it's the United States, it's European countries, it's Brazil. We have really polarized societies, polarized. the social cohesion is gone. There is no that kind of consensus any longer, what democracy means, what social values mean, what gender equality means, what inclusion means. I mean, that's an element of that. We have a polarized positions. Trump only can be as big because he has lots of white middle class or working class, I don't know, followers who admire him for his sexist and racist positions. And that's the point. I mean, if we got, let's say, internationally or globally, to the point where certain kind of identities and claims are admired, this is shocking. I think this is shocking. So that, yeah, if you read history books in hindsight, thinking, how could they? How could these women fell in love with Hitler and all these guys? And then you think, hang on, what we're seeing now has some kind of similarities with this kind of sexualization in a certain kind of sense of politics as well, and why this guy becomes so successful, or
Right.
eroticization, whatever. Yeah.
Right. Lastly, Professor Vieten, based on your recent article, Accomplices to Social Exclusion, Analyzing Institutional Process of Silencing, how do institutions systematically mobilize silencing as a tool of power, especially given the rise of populist radical right and far-right parties that are social and politically exclusionary? Can you elaborate on how institutional silencing specifically affects intersections of social class, gender, race, ethnicity, and what the potential effects of these exclusions and silencing might be in the upcoming EP elections?
Wow. Yeah, that's a very complex question, and touching on different dynamics inherent to all these problems. I start with institutional processes of silencing. We could argue, if we, let's say, in opposition to silencing, we could argue there is a right to free speech. Okay. So far-right parties, far-right politicians, they definitely have a right to speak about what they think is right and wrong. Likewise, populations who identify with these far-right populist views might have a right to tell these stories. On the other hand, of course, limitations in that sense of free speech have to be kind of bounded to what probably people would argue, positively speaking, constitutional rights, values, respect of others, and so forth. So there are limitations in that regard. The silencing, or what I see at the minute, and it's not automatically, let's say, overlapping with the silencing of far-right populist parties. I think that's one issue. What I'm seeing at the minute is institutional silencing is going on very controversial issues, and it's done differently in different countries. The whole, let's say, war in Gaza discussion, and I know this is very, very differently tackled in Ireland, in Spain, for example, very much in opposition to what the debate and discourse, the public debate and discourse, is in Germany and France, for example. A silencing here means, if I don't allow people to express different views in the public sphere, if I basically target people as anti-Semitic automatically because they are critical of a certain politician or Israeli politics at the minute, then I come, or might come, no, differently, I might trigger a situation where, coming back to what I said earlier, polarization and fragmentation, where increasingly people feel disenfranchised. And the far-right populist parties, they are on the table. Okay? So if there is this feeling of, I'm silenced, I can't express my opinion, I'm marginalized, that might trigger for different reasons also this uneasiness, and turning perhaps also to far-right parties, or I mean, perhaps also left-wing parties, though I don't see them at the minute. They're not that, let's say, that strong, which is different to years ago when we had left-wing populist parties in Greece and Spain, for example. So, but that's part of it, and that's, let's say, the macro societal dimension. Another issue is, which is like close to home, so to speak, institutions. And that could be institutions at universities, that could be like newsrooms, that could be like even like a public space, sitting on a bus or on a train. What does it need to, let's say, speak up, to overcome bystander silence? So rather kind of cultivate something which I would call anti-racism bystander habits. And that's an interesting thing because it's related to the idea to counter authoritarian characters, coming back again to the Frankfurt School. What they were writing on analyzing again, how did it emerge? How could National Socialism, and how did they become so successful? And they came up with this analysis saying like, yeah, it's the authoritarian character. Sorry, the authoritarian character. So what we need is really this kind of counter mobilization, countering, silencing of different views, and of course the traditions and culture of communication is different in different countries, but I guess it's also a need to learn conflict, to have a positive understanding of conflict, that conflict can be something positive. If you have a dispute, to accept, and also again perhaps training people to learn. And that's not only about mere, let's say, rhetoric to become a successful leader somewhere. What I mean is understanding how communication works, what's needed, and how enriching and expanding your insights could be, listening to a different view and then understand where the other person or the other view is coming from. And that's missing. So yeah, a lot to do, I'd say. A lot to do and to tackle. And unfortunately, my last sentence on this here is, as an academic, and I started writing on cosmopolitanism actually in Britain and Germany, in 2004, 2005, published on this in 2012. And back then, I thought the let's say the idea of cosmopolitanism is beautiful, but it can't exclude any groups or any people from other countries. So to think, and that's a very naive and perspective, that I can, let's say, argue or claim cosmopolitanism within as a specific cultural attitude for Europe, or of Europeans, or even worse, European Union member states citizen, is absolutely ridiculous. And so we have to be very, very aware. And again, back then, it was already visible that this might be co-opted for certain kind of middle-class mobility, cosmopolitan interests, but was not really taking on board what this vision actually could tell us. So the vision meaning we have to develop a culture of open-mindedness. We have to develop a culture of solidarity. We have to develop a culture of social justice and equality, which is still not there. Still not there, because it would mean sharing. It would mean sharing, and go back to this, what I said, local communities, and help them. I mean, I agree that this is nothing that you can do from one day to the other. but unlearning to a certain degree, unlearning a sense of entitlement that has been developed over centuries, so to speak, and learning how to lessen the angst, or engage with others, with the stranger. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Vieten, thank you so very much. Appreciate your
Yeah.
time.
You're welcome.